I'll keep the introductions short. To my left is David Thomson, a critic and writer I admired for many years before it became my privilege to meet him. And I have worn many hats with David. So in the interest of transparency, let me confess that in addition, I'm glad to say, of being friends, I published some of his writing when he wrote for me on occasion when I edited the Los Angeles Times book review. Later, I became David's literary agent, in which capacity I still function, although I wear another hat when 3 years ago I decided to embrace the nearly Scandinavian healthcare offered by Yale University Press and became an editor-at-large for them, in which capacity I asked David to write the book which is the occasion for this talk, which it's my duty as his publisher, his agent, and his friend to hold up.
He is also my uncle.
Yeah. So the charm, well, you'll be the judge, of this conversation is that it's an incestuous one between two people who have each in their own way been interested in acting, which is perhaps another way of saying that we have each of us in our own way tried to lead our lives and become a protagonist in our own unfolding drama. And it had occurred to me to ask David to write a kind of extended essay on acting, since he has been, I think it not too extreme to say, obsessed with the subject nearly all his adult life, and maybe even earlier than that, written about many movies, as you know, written and seen many dramas. And the idea that we would do so at the inaugural Bay Area Book Festival in the town in which I grew up made the whole affair very personal. And I just want to sort of tip of the hat to, I saw many wonderful productions in this town, from the work of the Magic Theater to the San Francisco Mime Troupe to an indelible performance by the Living Theater at the Berkeley Community Theater in February of 1969, Paradise Now and Frankenstein, and the many ways in which acting and actors have been important for me personally, as I suppose each in your own way they have been for you, forms the kind of bedrock on which we might have a conversation about a art form, a craft, a way of being in the world, which is as paradoxical and as necessary as I think anything is. So I'm put in mind of a perhaps apocryphal story that I heard many years ago in Los Angeles. Jack Lemmon once asked George Burns what was the single greatest attribute that one needed to be a successful actor. And Burns, never at a loss for words, instantly replied, sincerity. And if you can fake that, kid, you got it made. Which was perhaps about as good a definition of acting as I think I've ever heard. So I want to sort of turn it over for a moment to David and ask him a very simple question. What is it about acting that seems to mesmerize us? And over the course of time, what's changed? Obviously, acting from Thespis to Johnny Depp has a long and distinguished tradition, although by some measures disreputable. The Catholic Church, for most of its history, refused to allow actors to be buried with rites without first renouncing the sin of their entire profession. So tell us, if you would, how you think of acting and what has drawn you to the subject, and indeed why you think it matters so very much.
Well, I think it's rooted in our psyche. I think we are fascinated by actors because they are pretending to be someone else. I think almost always when we watch actors, we are watching two people. We are watching the character they're playing, and we're watching the real person we think we know as a professional career. And the interplay between those two, I think, is a large part of the pleasure. So when you follow an actor or an actress over decades, when you see Meryl Streep today, you remember Meryl Streep in, let's say, The Deer Hunter, where she's a very different kind of person. But you see over the years just what pretending has meant to her, which is interesting because Meryl Streep really has the reputation and a lot of the affect of a very sincere, serious, down-to-earth, honest person. And, compared with a lot of our leading actors, I think she deserves that. And I've only heard good things about her as a person. So why is she obsessed with pretending to be other people? I think this is a really core impulse in acting, and I think it's a core impulse in what we get out of them, because, and I don't know how far back this goes, because we can get onto this, but film changed our sense of acting. But I think it's because all of us in life are always pretending to be a slightly better version of ourselves that we would like to have presented to people. So when you meet someone for the first time, so to speak, physically but inside your head, you straighten up, you comb your hair, you smile, you be as open and accessible as you can. You present yourself in a way that says, look, I might be your friend. I might be your lover. I might live with you for 60 years. And in the course of 60 years, you will probably have to pretend to be several other people just to make time pass pleasantly and easily. But very briefly, I think it's because we are pretenders. Now, that can easily be interpreted as saying, well, we're all insincere. We're all liars. And I think those principles deserve more attention than they often get. But I don't think it's an unwholesome, unhealthy thing. I think the urge to pretend, to try to be someone else, a better version of ourselves, I think it's absolutely widespread. And any people who are in human company are involved with that, I think. And if you have a large family situation, you may sit back sometimes and say, I realize that I'm not quite the same person to my children as I am to my parents or my wife or friends. And I think we do this all the time. There's a fantastic process of modulation and adjustment that goes on without any conscious process, where we just become slightly different because we know that person wants A out of us, and that person wants B out of us. It's very complicated, and we do it, as we do so many things, because of a brain that is just so incredibly skillful.
Yeah. Do you think, you observe in your book that the Oscar, the Academy Award statuette that's given, and I don't think very many people tumble to this or focus on it, is a figure that is bearing a sword.
Yes.
Why?
I'm not literally sure of that. It's a very strange figure because in the original Oscar, the sword is actually sort of pinning pieces of film to the ground, which I don't think is what they meant us to interpret it by. But it's a sort of noble, classical figure. It's a sort of Arnold Schwarzenegger figure before his time. And everything about the Oscars is so bizarre. I mean, it could only have been invented. And of course, Oscar is really a way for the film business to pretend we're serious. We do good work. You know, respect us, for God's sake, respect us. The Oscars were invented for those purposes.
Right. I sometimes think, in a somewhat highfalutin way, that it's the unacknowledged admission that the sword acts for the actor, as Kafka is said to have regarded a book, as the axe that would break up the frozen sea within us.
Yes.
And that the art of dissembling, the act of pretending, the act of conscious deception itself, done well, reveals truths about our daily lives that we otherwise would not see or admit to ourselves.
You should have been there in 1927 when they first saw the Oscar statuette. You would have been laughed out of the room for what you just said.
I mean, this is the kind of comment that one can only get away with in Berkeley.
Of course.
You know, I want to be loyal to my roots.
Constituency. Yes.
Do you think it's a tension for actors, in particularly when they become, the best of them are so gifted at dissembling and faking authenticity, that in their own lives, many of the more intelligent of them begin to experience it as a kind of curse? I think of Louise Brooks, who would give up acting and become famous, really, for a refusal to engage in a kind of dishonest practices because she found it intolerable.
I think many actors, probably most of the really good actors, know that feeling. Late in life, when he was really a wrecked person in most ways, Brando taught a class in Los Angeles called Lying for a Living, and the title was given to this series with a real degree of self-contempt. Brando, I think, fell out of love with acting quite early on. On the other hand, someone like John Gielgud was acting into his early 90s and loved every moment of it, you know. And I think he was very lucky for that. I do think a lot of actors sense the problem that comes home to them. And you would have to say that a lot of actors, this is a big generalization, so forgive that part of it, but a lot of actors are not happy people. And I think some of them know that the unhappiness is the nervous energy that inspires what they do. And they've had very difficult lives. None more so than the lives of the huge majority of actors who never even get a job. The acting profession, so-called, is filled with people who have never given up the hope that one day they would get a breakthrough and they would get a big part. And they prepare for parts, they go to auditions where they are humiliated, really treated badly. And they stick at it, and they are old, impoverished, without pension, almost certainly, maybe without Social Security, because they've never really earned from it. We should remember that every actor is born unemployed, and they never escape that fear that they're going to be unemployed. That's why a lot of actors make bad decisions about what parts they will do, because they're terrified of not being able to play and pretend to be someone else.
Yeah. Or as Robert De Niro put it most recently 2 weeks ago when he delivered the commencement address at the graduating class of NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, after thanking the assembled faculty and congratulating the 2015 graduating class, he said, "Now, you're fucked." Which brought down the house. And by that, he went on to say, you know, unlike your fellow students who graduated the School of Accounting, they will have jobs. Unlike the people who are graduating at NY School of Law, and then he stopped and said, well, enough about them, they're lawyers. But you made a choice. You made a choice to follow your passions. It's going to be a lot of unemployment. It's going to be rejection. And then he said, but you knew that going in. And he
well,
talked
that's questionable.
interestingly.
I don't know how far 18-year-olds really know that. The passion is intense, and it should be. It has to be. I mean, there are many walks of life, like being a sportsman, where it's the passion at first that carries you into it, and you don't quite see what will happen when you're 34. And I think it's a very frightening situation to have a young person come to you and say, "Do you think I should be an actor?" That's happened to me a few times in life, and I've always said, you have to take responsibility for that decision. I'm sure your parents are hoping that you will not be an actor. Don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington, that kind of thing. And they're right. It's a terrible line of work to get into. And incidentally, that was the most coherent thing I've ever heard Robert De Niro say. He is a notoriously bad interview. And you know, he's done some great work. Not a lot of it recently, I think, but once upon a time, really great work. But if you ask him why and how and what, the answers are terrible.
But he's incoherent. Yeah, but in that, he probably has a lot in common with, I mean, again, at the risk of generalizing terribly, it's not uncommon in artists of many walks of life.
Oh, sure.
I mean, dancers, ballet dancers, opera singers, painters,
yes.
Even, I dare say, maybe even a lot of writers
Yes.
cannot, when asked, actually articulate what it is they do.
I know. And of course, we're in a culture that insists on asking those questions. So when Madison Bumgarner almost single-handedly won the World Series, there was Erin Andrews, I think it was her, saying, "How did it feel, Madison?" You know, he's simply not made to tell you how it feels. You were watching, how did it feel for you, you know?
Right. And in that sense, I often think that actors, along with other artists, the best of them, so wonderfully inhabit or exemplify traits that we wish often on our best day we could inhabit. But of course, their lines are written for them by others. They have the gift of a kind of emotional intelligence to inhabit a role without perhaps overthinking it and revealing it in a way that isn't given to us. But what we share with them, in line with what you're saying, is what Thoreau once called about most people leading lives of quiet desperation.
Yeah. And, you know, actors get enormous praise, and people will stop them on the street in restaurants and say, "Oh, I just love your work. It's meant so much to me." And it's very difficult to respond freshly to that all the time. And a lot of actors hate to be recognized and accosted by strangers, and for good reason, because there are strangers out there who do not have the best intentions toward actors, you know. In the age of celebrity, actors have suffered because they are treated often like famous people, which they are, but it's not what they set out to do.
And you make the observation in your book that this is, as it were, a recent development, that and has everything to do with the invention of photography and moving pictures.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we assume that acting has always been there, and it probably has. I invent a scene for the book of a caveman coming home after having a battle with a lion, and he's torn to pieces by the lion, but he killed the lion. And he's thinking as he goes back, what am I going to tell the people at home in the cave? Why I'm in this state? So he begins to work out a story, which may not be exactly what happened, you know. And maybe it was 2 lions he killed by the time he gets back. And you know, we, all of us, we build up what we have done. And we don't have writers. We are our own writer, which is a big burden. And actors often get to a point where they think they don't need the writer. It's a very interesting situation where an actor who has really sunk and soaked himself into a part over a long period, he knows what he has to say by heart, and he begins to think, well, if I was this character, I think I'd say something else there. Right. And the whole process of improvisation and taking off from the script, the text, is amazing. But, you know, once upon a time, hardly anyone saw actors. You go back to the 19th century, we know of famous actors from the 19th century. Hardly anyone saw them. And that's why movie changed everything. Because not only did everyone see Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and so on, but they saw them bigger than the side of a house. They saw them so beautiful, so dazzling, so shining with light, that the process of fantasy was let loose in a very big way. And people started to identify with actors, and they thought they were actors too. So it's encouraged this whole thing in an extraordinary way. And of course, you know, I mean, I had a student at Dartmouth a long time ago, 1970s, who was a television fiend. And I asked him, how much television a day do you watch? And he said, oh, it's seldom more than 7 hours a day, which shocked me terribly at the time. I just recently asked my son, who was 25, he's a writer, he works for a publisher, you know him. I said, try to estimate how many hours a day you spend looking at a screen. And he worked it out, and it was 11 and a half. And that's probably close to the truth for more of us. We are living through screens. And if you think that is the same as reality, you're wrong. And a big part of this book, and about really everything I try to do about acting, is about the way our deal with reality has altered immeasurably because of the movies.
Yeah. I want to shift the conversation a little bit on the ways in which the boundary between well, as it were, the mirror that's held up to us by these screens, and how we look at them, and how the boundary between the world that we live in and the permeable world that we enter virtually has elided or blurred the boundary between the way we, all of us, act in our own lives and the way in which those acts are projected back to us by the stories that are concocted and shown to us. Many years ago, I was in a production at the Florence Schwimley Little Theater, just down the street on Alston Way. It was a Berkeley High School production of Pearly Victorious. The year was 1968. The first act, I had a small role in the play, and it required in the first act that after I said a few lines, that I sat on a stool and other people had their lines while I just simply sat there. Of course, I was still, had to be in character, I was still present, and I have to confess that perhaps the epiphany that came to me during this sequence was made in some measure possible by the ingestion some hours earlier in the day of a hallucinogenic drug, which is, do I have any of my children in the audience? Anyway, and there came to be a moment when I sat on the stage and I looked out at the audience and I realized that I was the most powerful person in the room. And it was actually a frightening but also very thrilling moment when I realized that I could, with a single act, destroy or alter the entire history of the evening for everybody in the room. All I had to do was get up and say, this play is a piece of shit, and jump off the proscenium and stride out the hall. Well, whatever might happen afterward, it would be never forgotten. It would be quite a moment. I thought of that this morning because we are, this year, this month, like a couple months ago, is the 150th anniversary of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by a man who was the inferior actor, whose brother was the most famous actor of his day, Edwin Booth, and his brother Edmund was something of a failure as an actor, but who nonetheless leaps on the balcony of Ford's Theater, assassinates the president, and forever upstages his brother.
And jumps down onto the stage. Takes the power position. Yeah.
So if you ask the question, does acting matter? You bet it does. I mean, there's a guy who just strode onto the stage of history and made the theater very much larger than, no one remembers the play that Lincoln was
No, right.
seated
Well,
at.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And the power that an actor feels, I think sometimes teachers have it. You know, you may occasionally feel you have a class in the palm of your hand, and you pause to just to sort of let that sink in, and what you say next is going to be remarkable. You see what I mean about the way we present ourselves. And I think the power is very much a part of it, because actors are always amazed when you talk to them as if they were great and famous and successes. Very few actors think they're successes. There is a sort of stereotype of the vain actor, rather like the character in the play 20th Century and the film. Acting his head off all the time, showing off and just browbeating other people. I've never met an actor and talked to them at any length without discovering the desperate insecurity. And I think another part of why they do it, and why we do what we do, is because for a moment we may have a feeling, an illusion of power over the chaos of life. And that's a heady thing. That's an hallucinogenic. And you don't go to prison for it. I'm sure you don't go to prison anymore, but I don't.
It's 12:33. Time passes all too quickly when the play is really something you want to listen to. I do want to invite some questions from the audience as well. So let me do so now. I will repeat the question unless you're capable of standing up and
Speak the speech.
Yeah, but no speeches, just the question. So, yes, young man there.
Two questions. I'm sure you get some blowback from the acting profession, and I was wondering, what's your opinion on an actor like Daniel Day-Lewis?
Could everyone hear the question? He says, I'm sure you get some blowback on your opinions. What's your opinion of Daniel Day-Lewis? Is that fair enough?
Well, the book has been reviewed by a very distinguished actor, Simon Callow, and it was a friendly review. I don't think I've heard yet of other actors saying anything about it, and I think actors are very cautious when they're talked about in this kind of way. I think Daniel Day-Lewis is one of the really remarkable actors of our time. I tell a story in the book. He did Hamlet at the National Theatre, in the late 80s, I think. And he was not the figure he is today, but he did Hamlet at the National Theatre, which was a real test, because there you have an audience who know the play inside out. And in the course of the play, he was a method actor, still is. He began to see in Hamlet something that resembled him, which was the loss of a father. Day-Lewis's father, who was a famous writer, died about 15 years earlier. But he got into that more and more. And other people in the production could see that this was making life very difficult for him. And you know, you play a real part. You're walking a tightrope with sharks in the sea. It's a dangerous thing. You're playing with your own self. And one night, Day-Lewis started sobbing on stage, and he walked off. The most unspeakable thing that an actor can do, just terminate the performance and get off. And there was a delay of about 15 minutes. And then Jeremy Northam, his understudy, came on and delivered a superb performance. Day-Lewis has never been back on stage since. But I think he's a remarkable figure, yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned when you were talking about Robert De Niro that previously he'd done some great acting, and recently not so much. I'm interested to hear what was great earlier about De Niro, but more than that is what is great acting, rather than just De Niro himself, but what makes great acting.
What makes great acting? Tell us more about what you think worked well, as you say, earlier in De Niro's career, and what didn't work so well later in it.
Well, I think that there was a period of time, the 70s, began in the late 60s, but through the 70s, when De Niro, in movie after movie, delivered people that we immediately recognized, like Travis Bickle, but whom we'd not really seen in a film before. I think he enlarged our sense of what people could be. And I think one way or another, he kept the company of challenging directors. And he just did a run of things. And I think gradually into the 80s, not to say there weren't some good pieces of work later, but gradually he became interested in business, became a restaurateur, became a figure in Tribeca. Really, I think, got very interested in money. And why should he not be? Most of us are. And we live in a society that is obsessed with it. So why should an artist not be very interested in money? But I do think over a long period of time, you can see him getting into films that once upon a time I don't think he would have done. And I think his attitude to it has become duller, a little blunter. And I think a lot of actors of that age are disillusioned. And in part it's because it's virtually impossible to make a film like Taxi Driver anymore. You know, it's amazing that that was done. And a whole lot of films at that time were done. It was a great time. And I don't think you can do it now, and it doesn't seem likely to come back. What makes a great actor? Well, it's clearly some specially refined sensitivity that can translate the urge to pretend into movement, speech, and maybe most important of all, doing nothing. Steve talked about his great performance many years ago, where he was just sitting. A supreme test.
And not speaking.
A supreme test of great acting is having nothing to do and being inescapable in the process. A wonderful American film called Rio Bravo was made in the late 1950s, and John Wayne was cast in it. And he said to the director, well, I've read the script, Howard, and, you know, it'll be a great film, I think, but Dean Martin, he's got the part. He's the guy trying to recover from being an alcoholic. What do I do all the time? He's got the shakes and everything. And Hawke said, you just stand there and look at him like someone who cares for him. And Wayne is one of our most underrated actors, for good reason. He did a lot of other things that we don't like or approve of. He was a fantastic screen actor. And if you look at Rio Bravo, and you could look at it tonight with Prophet, he just looks at Dean Martin as if he cares. You can't beat that in acting, you know. You can't beat it in life. How many awkward situations have you managed to get through in life because you've just turned to someone and looked at them and said, I care. Or not even said it, but they see it. And I think that's a very important thing of acting. I think you also have to say knowing the right people. Being in a situation that De Niro was in New York in '75, where the people with great ideas for films come to you. So that's important. I think it's terribly important to have the right advice. Actors are surrounded with entourages, and we sort of make fun of them. And a lot of them are opportunists just taking advantage of the actor. but a lot of them give golden advice, suggestions. So that's another thing. I think luck is horribly important. Often when you take on a film, if you're an actor or a play, you're told, well, your co-stars will be A, B, and C, and it will open there on that date. So-and-so will direct it. Sounds wonderful. Sounds like a project made in heaven. By the time you get there, the actors playing with you are X, Y, and Z. Someone else is directing it. It's not in the theater you were told about. It's just not a good place to be with it. And luck plays a real part in it. And I think that the people who are unemployed live with the dream that, oh, if only they could have got Sophie's Choice, they'd have knocked it out of the park. You know, well, probably, almost anyone could have done Sophie's Choice and reduced us to tears. And it's the luck of a part that comes along. And in most acting careers, there are parts that made all the difference. And it often comes down to luck that you got the part. So all of those things come into play.
We've got a lot of questions, and time is running out. Yes, ma'am?
Are you concerned about the future of acting, considering the kinds of films that Hollywood seems to be making and embracing? They're remakes, they're sequels. There's not a lot of really inventive stuff coming out of Hollywood. Does that worry you?
Are you concerned about the future of acting, given how terrible Hollywood is?
I've given up worrying about Hollywood. I think the impulse to act is going to last quite a while yet. And I generally agree with your assessment of Hollywood films. But I would say some of the great acting of recent years has been Bryan Cranston as Walter White, Gandolfini as Tony Soprano, Claire Danes as Carrie Matheson, and you know, hordes of others. And I think there's a real connection between the terrible decline in the American mainstream movie and the way that we are enjoying a kind of television that may be as good as television's ever managed. I think, in other words, the people with ideas, people like David Chase, Vince Gilligan, and the writers and the actors have gone into television, which is not often as lucrative for them. But, you know, actors generally will go where the good work is. So I think a lot of people are staying home watching box sets rather than go out to movies. However, I would have to say that I went to see Mad Max this week because I'm a Tom Hardy fan. But Charlize Theron owns the film and is amazing in it, you know. So you could be surprised.
Yes, back there. Yes, sir?
Are actors born or made?
Are actors born or made?
Well, you could say that about doctors. You could say it about anybody, really. I think it's a bit of both. I think the interesting thing about acting is that history has taught us that the educational processes that grow up for actors, which were very popular in Britain, teaching you how to stand on stage and fence and, you know, slide down the banister, all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure how useful they are. I think that most artists, rather than go to art school, probably need to get out in life and into a pretty uncomfortable version of life, because I think they'll learn more. But I think that probably any actor knows that what happened in the earliest days are very important. I saw a documentary about Ingrid Bergman this week, and the film, this is some pains to say that Ingrid was shaped by losing both her parents early and by the influence they had on her and the way in which that focused her sense of herself. In other words, she was a little unhappy as a child. Well, anyone here who was not unhappy as a child? But we're not all great actors. So, you know, there is something unique in the genes, but you never know. You never know. Joseph Welsh. Do you all know who Joseph Welsh was? He was the lawyer who really pinned McCarthy in '54, I think, on television. And he was a lawyer, trained as a lawyer, and he spoke well as a lawyer. But if you look at the clip of film that involves him and McCarthy, there's no question he acted better in that scene. And not long after those hearings, Otto Preminger cast him as the judge in Anatomy of a Murder. He'd never dreamed of acting. And I think it's the case that there are people out there, probably people in here, who have never acted, but if the right part came along, might be extraordinary.
Of course, very famously, De Sica and Bresson
Yes.
were devoted or very
amateur
drawn
actors,
and,
yes.
and made a central part of their filmmaking.
That's right.
Of,
And
of casting the non-actors.
hated to use them again once they'd been used, yeah, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Just wondering if you have ever studied acting and if you would have some thoughts on what a class in acting might do for the rest of us who don't want to become professionals.
Have you ever thought of acting yourself, and any suggestions you might have for the rest of us who...
What could we get out of an acting class if we don't want to be a professional?
Yeah. Should we take an acting class, and could we learn something? And I'm afraid this will have to be the last question because they have another class coming in, and David will sign some books in the lobby if you care to purchase one.
I think the ideal class on acting would be to gather a group of people at random, to bring them together, let them meet each other and know each other, and come up with a situation to be discussed among the group, to cast it, but maybe then to cast it in different ways, and to play with it and begin to think of, well, what should the character say? What should the action be? You would make the play from scratch without any intention of performing it. But I think that process might be an educational process about life in general that you would never forget. I think that if I were to do a class like that, that's how I would do it. It is incidentally very close to the way Mike Leigh makes his films. I have never acted professionally, but I am a constant and devoted amateur actor.
The one thing I think we should leave you with is that acting requires spectators. It requires an audience. And the act of acting is not complete, just as the act of writing is not complete without readers. So think of yourselves as co-collaborators in the process of why acting matters. If it matters at all, it matters to every one of us. And may I say, I have a vested interest in it, of course, but in every sentence that David has written in this little book and in his other books as well, you will find a necessary oxygen. Thank you very much for your attention.